Hello and welcome back. It's been a few weeks, but I'm back for some off-season content, and today we're going to go over what happened in the Fantasy Puck Creators League. Now, if you missed that content earlier, Fantasy Puck put together a league for all the various fantasy hockey content creators out there, and it was really competitive all year long. So today we're going to look at what unfolded, what strategies paid off more than others, and why my team sucked so bad, and it was bad. I ended up in 8th place at the end of the year and missed the playoffs by a couple of points on the last day of the regular season, so not a good ending to that. That was my worst finish over the last maybe 4 years of all of my different leagues that I've been playing in fantasy. So I learned quite a bit through this process. It was definitely a challenge, and that's why we're going to take a look at it today, because these are some of the better fantasy hockey players out there. There's 6 diamond players, I believe, in this league, and a lot happened. So without any further ado, let's break down what ended up happening. So first off, we have the standings. We've got what ended up happening. Nate from Apples and Genos, he won the entire championship. We'll get into his team in just a little bit. Mr. Clutch, Fantasy Tipped, finished 2nd place. He had a pretty good run in the playoffs. And then you had Fired Up Fantasy in 3rd place. Now, again, I finished 8th, so that's what it's showing here. And if you look at the matchups, there were some really good ones. This one was really close. Fired Up Fantasy and Dauber Hockey, that was a close one. Comes down to 13 points at the end of the week. This one, a little bit less close. FP Don did pretty well in the quarterfinal. Nate and Mr. Clutch had a bye in the first round. Then Nate cleans up Fantasy Puck Don in the semifinals. Not that close. It's relatively close, but again, a couple, maybe, 40 points or plus or minus a little bit there. And then you've got Mr. Clutch here, a pretty resounding victory over Fired Up Fantasy. And that brings them to the championship game where Nate absolutely took care of business. He had an astounding team all year long. And again, we will break that down in just a minute. Fired Up Fantasy put up a massive amount of points in the 3rd place game. That would have challenged Nate for the championship had he gotten to that point after passing through the semifinals. But he ends up with 3rd place nonetheless. Now, if we look back at the standings, hopefully you guys can see this. I'm trying to manage 2 screens here, but what you've got here at the top is a couple of teams at 15 and 7. Down here, there's 1 or 2 teams that were below 500, but basically from data-driven hockey all the way up, everyone was close to or around 500 or better. So nobody ran away with the league, although Nate did have a really good team. If you look at the points, he had over 9,000 points, but so did Daily Dose Hockey. They both had a lot of points, and Daily Dose actually had a little bit more in terms of raw points, just couldn't get those victories when they counted in the matchups. So we'll get into both of those teams in just a second, looking at what their strengths and weaknesses were, but just wanted to show you the breakdown of how everything played out. And again, my lowly team over here at 11 and 11 throughout the year battled injuries. And I guess before we look at some of the teams overall and what their strengths and weaknesses were, let's take a look at the team that I put together for this league. So this is what my team looked like after the draft. Now, if you watched the live stream, I did do a live stream of this draft. I went with Hughes at 11. I was hoping to get Cale Makar at 14. He went 13. So right off the bat, I had to pivot and do something else, and I should have gone Rasmus Dahlin. That was the guy I was leaning towards to have those 2 elite defensemen. Instead, I chose Tage Thompson and regretted it for the entire rest of the season. Next, I picked Josh Morrissey, and I remember at the time, after the draft, I watched back on Fantasy Puck's video, and they were kind of questioning why I didn't pick Adam Fox, especially being a Rangers fan. I should have picked Fox. And I thought of Morrissey as being more complete, and using the Data Draft custom rankings dashboard, Morrissey was scoring a little bit higher because of how good of a season he put up last year, not just with the offensive production, but with the peripherals as well. Morrissey was a solid option. He did have a dip in the middle of the year, but he came back strong, and he was a pretty decent option for me. Fox might have been a little bit better when it counted the most down towards the stretch heading into the playoffs because he was a power play monster at that point. Then I make my mistake with Georgiev. This is a play where I was looking at just wins. And at this point in the draft, I'm like, okay, I didn't get off to a good start. I've got to try to find an angle. And everybody else had the goal-scoring right wingers. They had all the players that I was looking to grab. So I figured the only way I could do anything is to try to grab goaltenders. So I grabbed Georgiev for the wins because those were heavily weighted. So before we go any further, let's take a look at the point weighting for this league. So you can see here, goals were weighted at 6. That's probably why I went with Tage Thompson at that number 14 spot. You have assists at 4, power play points at 2. So a power play assist is as good as a goal, and that's why Fox might have been a better option than Morrissey in that spot. Shots on goal, 0.9. That's something that I did try to focus on in the draft, and you'll see that in the stats as we move forward. Hits were 0.5 point, and blocks were 1 point. So the blocking defensemen, more so than the hitting defensemen, were valuable in this league. Then for goaltending, wins was 5 points, and that's why I went with Georgiev, just thinking that he would put up those wins and hoping he would be close to that .922 save percentage he was the previous year. Instead, he reverted back to his around .900 save percentage, which is what he had before coming over to Colorado. So this is the point weighting. You got shutouts at 3. Those are harder to predict. Goals against -3, that is where the goaltending became kind of a problematic theme for my team and a number of other teams. Getting those goals against. There was a ton of goals scored this year in the league, and that is a trend that we'll notice as we move forward. And then saves, 0.6. So not a lot in terms of raw save numbers. You couldn't kind of spam saves, but we'll see what Nate did with his team, sort of doing something to that effect. Back at my team and what I ended up doing in the draft, Panarin at 5, at 59th overall was my absolute best pick. He was a top 10 player, top 5 in almost every fantasy league. That was an incredible pick. Konechny was actually a really good pick here at 6. Montour didn't end up having the season that he had last year, and that ended up biting me, especially because he was injured for the first chunk of the season, so I didn't have him, and I was expecting him to come back and kind of carry me. I needed those 2 elite defensemen, and that was going to be Morrissey and Montour. Montour didn't end up being in that role. He wasn't anywhere near as good as he was in 22-23. He did pick it up towards the end of the season, so that did help a little bit, but it was garbage time. I didn't make the playoffs. Toffoli, Buchnevich, these guys were basically waiver status. A lot of these guys ended up on the waiver wire. CHATBOT I held on to all year, but he was hurt in and out of the lineup, and that was painful to watch on my team as well. I did get the Vegas tandem, and at the beginning of the year, they were carrying me, especially Adin Hill. The average player, the average really good player, I should say, the top players in the league were averaging around 13, 14 points per game, and Adin Hill was averaging over 20 points per game. So that's why I went with goaltending. That's where I thought I could make it up. But then Adin Hill gets hurt, and then I have to rely on Logan Thompson and Georgiev, and obviously Georgiev letting in a ton of goals. Had a number of 4-goal games that were killing me in the standings, so that didn't help at all. Kadri ended up being a pretty good player. I don't think I ended up keeping him for that long, and I probably should have held on to him because he was really good, and I had him in my other league. He was very solid in that one. Spurgeon, Arvidsson, Cooley, Clark, all of these guys hit the waiver wire, so not a lot going on there. So now let's take a look at how these points were divvied up. Were they offensive teams? Were they defensive teams? Let's take a look at that right now. So here you can see the standings over here on the right. What you have here is the skater rating, the combined skater rating. So what I did is I assigned a percentile average for each metric that was involved in the point weighting system, and then just basically gave a skater rating, which is out of 100, and then a goalie rating out of 100. So what you would want out of both of these is to be up here in the top right corner. So the closest to that you can see is Daily Dose Hockey. And what that means is, if you look down here, this is the combined rating. He was a 67.67, which is the highest rated team in the league. So what I was talking about earlier with the points, you can see here Daily Dose had the most points, and that's why, because he had excellent goaltending. His goaltending rating 55.75 and his skater rating 75.62. So that's percentile essentially. 55th percentile and then 75th percentile for skaters. So combine those, and it was really good for Daily Dose Hockey. He ended up making the playoffs, but as we mentioned before, lost in one of, I think it was the semifinal round. And that ended up being just a matchup thing because he had a really solid team and was really well built, constructed from top to bottom. Compare that with Nate from Apples and Genos. He had the best offense, and this kind of ties into the data draft strategy and what I've been saying in a lot of those videos, which is you need to have the best offense. Goaltending is less important than offense, and never before have we seen it play out like this, where you have Nate from Apples and Genos having some of the worst goaltending in the league, highest record in the regular season and winning the championship. So this is where it played out. You want to have that good offense. His offense, 84th percentile, which is technically speaking, the best out of this bunch just because of the way things broke out. It was a pretty tightly compacted league. Not a lot of, guys that were incredibly productive offensively in terms of, dominating week over week. But for whatever reason, his team was more than likely going to win the offensive categories every single week. And that showed out in the way that the season unfolded. So There's a couple of other things to take notice of down here. New Jersey Injury Ninjas had the worst skater rating, and then you can see them down here at the bottom of the standings, and that is sort of that correlation causation thing. Did also have the fewest amount of moves, so maybe wasn't as involved and engaged as some of the other players, but with that said, it is still trending with you need to have that offense. And so you look at data-driven hockey, they had a pretty decent season. You look at Daily Dose hockey, they had a pretty decent season. Daily Dose made the playoffs. A lot of these teams in the middle ended up making the playoffs. So Mr. Clutch, he was in the championship game, I believe. Fired Up Fantasy was third. Josh from Apples and Ginos was right on the cut line, ended up seventh at the end of the day. I believe he beat me in one of the consolidation or consolation, whatever brackets. So this was a pretty good strategy from both of these Apples and Ginos guys. They had a pretty good offense, but he went goaltending over skating. He went skating over goaltending, and that's how it played out. Now, as we look at some of these teams, let's take a look at Nate's team from Apples and Ginos. This is how it broke down in terms of the numbers. So he had 92nd percentile goal production, 76th percentile assists, 69th power play points, and then 92nd percentile shots and hits. And then he followed that up with some blocks as well, and didn't care as much about the goaltending, but he did get raw saves. So what you have here in the middle is Nate's team from Apples and Ginos, and then to the right of him is New Jersey Injury Ninjas. So this is number 1 and number 12, and you can kind of compare and contrast them. So he starts off with Austin Matthews. He has a 69 goal season. Obviously, that's going to be one of the reasons why he's 92nd percentile in goal scoring. Then he gets JT Miller, who puts up a 103-point season and a ton of peripherals. He had shots, hits, blocks, everything, power play points. Miller was an absolute dog this year. Then he follows it up with Dougie Hamilton, who gets hurt. So I mentioned that I had a bunch of injuries. I had guys like Tage Thompson out, Jack Hughes was out with a shoulder injury, Aiden Hill was out, Brandon Montour was out. Didn't get my full lineup in an actual week until week 17. So that was a huge hindrance to my team, but it was not a hindrance to Nate's team. He was able to navigate around that. And part of the reason is because of the excellent players that he ended up drafting in this top 10 range. So you look at Jake Gensel in the 4th round, Matt Boldy in the 5th round, really good wingers there. Chris Letang and Zach Werenski, good peripheral coverage defensemen. Letang getting you blocks, getting you some hits, some shots. Werenski, usually shot volume, was also getting a bunch of blocks. Then he follows that up with probably his best pick of the entire draft, Philip Forsberg at 95. He was a top 10 player in fantasy all year long. He was incredible this year. Follows that up with Drake Batherson. Follows that up with Mike Matheson, who's a really good peripheral defenseman. And then Ehlers wasn't bad at all. He did end up hitting the waiver wire. Sam Bennett he held on to for at least half the season. Same with Ekblad. And then you get down here to the goaltending, Grubauer and Korpisalo. So he basically faded goaltending and almost went complete zero goaltending strategy. Essentially, you're in the 14th round. It's basically an afterthought at this point. Now, he did hold on to Korpisalo for quite a while, and he held on to Jenner for quite a while. But some of these other guys, Grubauer wasn't the best pick there, but honestly, that's his first miss. Out of all of these picks, his first miss comes in the 14th round. So that's another thing that I've mentioned in the data draft strategy. You can't swing and miss in the first 6 rounds. He definitely didn't. Dougie Hamilton would have been a good player for him. He would have been an even better team had he had him. But regardless, even with that injury, he put together a really good team throughout the first 13 rounds of the draft. And this didn't end up hurting him at all. He ended up streaming some goaltenders. He went with Decord for a little bit. He ended up with, he held on to Korpisalo for quite a while and then just faded in other goaltenders as they got hot. And again, Decord was basically the starter for a couple of months on end and was one of the better goaltenders in the league. And you could find him off waiver wire. So that's the number 1 team in the league. And then you compare that with the number 12 team in the league. And basically exactly what I've mentioned in the data draft strategy. Don't draft a goaltender too high. He goes Shesterkin here at 22nd. Now, Shesterkin turned it on after the All-Star break and was basically back to his old self. But for the first 2/3 of the season, he was not that good. Same thing, Timo Meier, that's basically a swing and a miss until the last couple of weeks of the season when he did turn it on. Basically, after they traded Tyler Toffoli, Timo Meier started to turn it on and be the player that he used to be in San Jose. Hischier's not a bad pick there. Saros isn't a bad pick there, but it wasn't Saros' best year. by his own standards. You have Dylan Larkin at 70. That's a great pick, but his best pick of the entire draft is this Sam Reinhart pick at 75. That's never going to happen again. Now he's put up over 50 goals in a season. He's never going to be this late. A lot of you might have got Sam Reinhart late in the draft. That's probably never going to happen again. And then basically the rest of these guys are waiver wire guys. Skinner, Taves, Giroux, Dursey. Ben was okay. Hughes was okay. Besser's a good pick here at 166. That turned out really nice for him. And then some defensemen, Hronek, Power, and Larson. So a lot fewer misses from Nate, Apples and Genos, and then on top of that, he had some gems like Philip Forsberg late here in the 8th round. Matheson in the 10th round is a big pickup. Sam Bennett in the 12th round is pretty nice to have there as well. But having those high-end offensive players mixed in with some powerful wingers like Boldy and Gensel, he would have had his 2 elite defensemen. He would have had Hamilton, Letang, Werenski. That's a good decor, plus Matheson and Ekblad, but obviously ended up losing Dougie Hamilton. But just quickly comparing that bar graph to my team, you can see how hollow this is. There's so many holes in this roster. I did go for goals. I was above 50th percentile there. I went for shots. I'm 69th percentile there, but not really great in assists or power play points. The hits were okay, but that wasn't a heavy weighting. That was a half a point per hit. Blocks were more important, and I was really bad there. And I went for goaltending. I did get the wins. I did get the raw save count, and I did get some shutouts. So overall, the goaltending wasn't horrendous, as I did have Georgiev and the Vegas tandem, and I ended up, I believe, with Cam Talbot for the last couple weeks of the season. However, goaltending does not win you championships. Offense wins you championships. So now let's take a look at Daily Dose Hockey. He had the best point total in the season and ultimately did not end up winning, but that's just a matter of matchups. He did put together a really good team, and he was really solid across the board for offense. 84th in goals, 84th in assists, 92nd in power play, and then the shots 84th and the hits 76th percentile. Blocks were a little bit lower, goaltending was a little bit lower, but he made up for it with goals against and shutouts. So Daily Dose over here on the far right starts it off with Brady Tkachuk, snipes Cale Makar, who was that's who I was targeting. So he was the one at the back end of the snake that was in between where I was picking. So this is where I hoped to have Cale Makar at 14. He ends up picking him up at 13. That worked out really well for him, but he also hits a home run with Braden Point here at 36. That's a huge guy to pick up in that range. 36 is probably about as late as you're going to pick up Braden Point. At this point in his career, he's a 50-goal scorer playing with Kucherov, and Kucherov was absolutely ballistic this year. Svechnikov is not a bad pickup here. I always consider him a little bit underwhelming. He goes ice cold for stretches, but he is relatively complete. But this is a huge pickup. Quinn Hughes at 60. He became the top defenseman in the entire league for at least the first half of the season and continued that throughout the rest of the season. Follows it up with McAvoy, very complete defenseman, and then Demko is the reason why his goaltending stats were so good, as we just saw with the goals against and the shutouts. So Demko was probably the starting goaltender that carried him the most. Cousins was a waiver guy. He ended up getting probably sent to the waiver wire. Chris Kreider at 108 is crazy because he's a former 50-goal scorer. This year he was a 39-goal scorer, basically a 40-goal scorer. And you can find him this late and then pair that with Jonathan Marchessault, who's also a 35, 40-goal scorer on the wing. These are really good winger pickups later in the draft. You follow that up with Bo Horvat, who's a goal scorer, more often than not a goal scorer, although they did go cold a couple times throughout the season. Jake DeBrusk, not a bad pickup here. And then Swayman at 156 is absolute insanity. No idea how Swayman fell that far. And then Schmaltz, Suzuki's actually a pretty good pickup there at 180 if he held on to him all year. Sharon Govich did hit the waiver wire a bunch of times, but that was, in hindsight, a pretty good pickup, a 30-goal scorer in the 16th round. And then OEL basically just for that front half where Montour was injured. So a pretty solid team all around. Not many misses. This Dylan Cousins is a little bit of a miss. But other than that, hitting on almost every single pick in the top 10, and then getting a couple of guys down here that are very valuable. Swayman, Horvat, Suzuki. Schmaltz is a good serviceable player. Same with Sharon Govich, but no real misses down here. Just, not any home runs that he found late in the draft, other than maybe Swayman. That would definitely be classified as a home run. So just in terms of strategy and what these guys are going for, Daily Dose did get his top defenseman. So he had Makar, he had Hughes, he had McAvoy, 3 elite power play quarterback type defensemen. 2 of those more offensive than McAvoy. McAvoy more of a peripherals D, but he had a little bit of everything there. He did have his starting goaltender. found another really good goaltender late in the draft. So a really more, conventionally built team as opposed to Nate's team, which was basically zero goalie. But that's going to do it for this video. Hopefully you got something informative out of this. If you want other off-season content, let me know what you'd like to see in the comments below. I'll be doing a recap of how the data draft strategy worked out throughout the season and how I obviously failed in this league by not sticking to that draft strategy, and then potentially tweaking and adding in some factors in terms of what happened with goaltending this year and how nobody had any kind of pulse on goaltending throughout the entire season. Does that mean we need to go zero goaltender this year? Who knows? We'll have to wait and see. But I want to thank you all for signing up and showing your support throughout the season. I truly appreciate it. The championship belt has been mailed out for the data draft league, and if you want a chance to win that, you'll have to sign up for the Patreon and get into the data draft league next year. Hopefully we can find some process to set that up so it's nice and fair, maybe a lottery or something like that. But thank you again for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.